So today we're going to continue our study in Ephesians, looking at verse 11 to 14. And I want to just pick up these two ideas that we see in verse 11, that we have an inheritance that has been predestined according to the purpose of Him, according to God's purposes. Okay, and these are two ideas that we see right through this first section. And as I said, the best way to get the most out of the scripture is to see it in the context, one verse in the context of a whole section or a whole paragraph. And so I want to just highlight, to start with, this idea that God has chosen us, right, or predestined us. And so again, Paul uses this idea 3 times, right? He's chosen us, He's predestined us, and again we hear here in verse 11 this idea that God predestined us. This is the idea, right, that you and I have been chosen by God. We have been chosen for whatever reason, and we're going to talk about the reason in a moment. We have been chosen by God, which first of all shows us something about the amazing love of God, is that God loved us before we did anything. Before we did anything right, before we did anything wrong, God loved us. But it's also incredibly humbling, because, as we're going to see, when we realise that we have been chosen, it should change the reason we live. So the next question I want to ask is okay then, well, why did God choose us or predestine us to become sons through Jesus Christ? Well, we see the same idea repeated multiple times. We see according to the purpose of His will. It's according to God's will that He decided. And again here, the mystery of His will according to His purpose. It's the purpose of His will. And we come down to the verses we're focusing on this morning, which is verse 11. According to the purpose of Him. You see, and so what we are seeing is that we are predestined because God had a plan and a purpose in order to bring about something else. So what was God's purpose? And we see again, we're going to see 3 times a phrase that Paul uses. We see in verse 6, why did God do it? For the praise of His glorious grace. His glorious grace. Not ours, but His. And again, we come down and we see here, it is in verse 12, be to the praise of His glory. And it finishes in verse 15, to the praise of His glory. And so why is this important? You said, Tim, why are you highlighting these things that Paul is bringing out in this text? Well, number one, Paul is saying that you and I are chosen by God. We are chosen not because of anything we've done, but because He decided. Well, why did God choose it? Right? Why did God decide to? Because that was His purpose, the purpose of His will. It was His will to decide it. Now, what was the purpose? Why then? What was He trying to accomplish? And this is the key, all right, that we see here. It was to the praise of His glory. For the praise, can't spell there, of His glory. Now, what an amazing statement that is, to the praise of His glory, is that we were chosen by God according to the will of God in order to be to the praise not of our glory but His glory. Our lives are to speak of the glory of God, and that is why you and I have been saved. We haven't been saved just for our purposes and our benefit. We've been saved for His glory. And I suppose that's our question as we reflect on this morning, is how are we living for the glory of God? Do our lives reflect the praise of His glory?